Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this month's Digging In with TPS-MTSU. We're really excited to have you join us for this edition. A couple of quick things as we get started. Of course, as always, for those of you joining us live, be sure to keep your mics muted. And as always, we do like for these sessions to be interactive. So feel free to open up the chat box, introduce yourself, use that as a place to ask questions, make comments. Throughout the session, we will be monitoring that as we go along. And for those of you who are watching this on the YouTube channel, we invite you to join us for a live session at some point so that you can get that interactive feature as well. With this series, we do have a Padlet page where you can find all of the resources referenced in today's session, as well as to find resources for all of the previous sessions in the Digging In series. We have been doing this now for a couple years, and so you can find quite a bit of material on that Padlet, which you can access via this link or using the QR code here. So this month we are doing Notable First, and I'm going to turn things over to my colleague Stacy, who's going to talk to us a little bit about our theme for the month as we get going.
All right. Thank you, Kira. I'm going to share my screen real fast, and we're going to be looking at our newsletter for this month. This isn't the first time we've done Notable Firsts as a theme. We did one the first one was in April 2017, and I'm going to show you what that one looks like. So this is the April 2017 one where we covered Leonard Bernstein, the first American-born composer to gain international acclaim, Constance Baker Motley, the first woman to be hired by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and for you 8th grade teachers, Whiskey Rebellion, which was the first time that the federal government actually used troops to enforce a federal law. And it was also the first time that a sitting president led troops in the field. But of course, it was George Washington, so he kind of doesn't count because he was the first president to do so many things. But it was also the last time a sitting president ever led troops in the field. So that's kind of interesting. There's some resources about the First World War, first Black architects here in Nashville. This is a really good topic if you're doing a place-based thing in Middle Tennessee, the McKissick and McKissick architecture firm, first women in the U.S. Army, the first recorded globe, for those of you who like to work in material culture and geography, and the first hypnosis machine, just for fun. So that is what we covered in the first issue of Notable Firsts, and you're going to find out more about what we chose for this issue. I'm going to cover some of these things in the resources section, but at the end of the webinar today. But we do have 3 different lesson ideas that we tackled for this newsletter. And I am going to start off by covering a lesson idea on Rabindranath Tagore. And it took me a while to learn how to say his name, but it's Rabindranath Tagore, and I probably still may not be pronouncing it totally correctly, but I couldn't believe I'd never heard of this person before because he's fascinating, and I'm really glad that I had this chance to learn more about him. So how is he a notable first? Well, I'm going to take us to the PowerPoint that I created for this, and we're going to start that. So Rabindranath Tagore was a poet, and he was from India. He lived from 1861 to 1941, and so his lifespan really covered a period in which the British were very heavily involved in the administration and government of India. And he died right before Indian independence from Great Britain but he was alive during a lot of the push towards independence, some of those movements. So he had a very long life, and he witnessed a lot of change. But he was a real polymath, which is a great word that you can explain to your students, means he was good at a lot of things. He did poetry, he wrote novels and short stories, he wrote plays, he wrote music and song lyrics. He actually wrote what is today the national anthem for both India and Bangladesh. He also was involved with social reform. He was a philosopher. He was friends with Gandhi. He met all sorts of people. He started an educational institution. He did a lot. And so, you know, why shouldn't we have heard of this person before in the West? Because he's pretty much famous in his home country. So he's the first non-European to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. And I can't say he's the first non-European to win a Nobel Prize in any category, because I believe Teddy Roosevelt was the first non-European. But Rabindranath Tagore was the first person of color, as far as I could find out. And if I'm wrong, please let me know. But to win a Nobel Prize in any category. He won in the year 1913 for a body of literature, mainly dealing with his collection of poems called Gitanjali that was published in English. He actually translated his own poems into English. So that right there shows you a lot of the British influence in Indian cultural life, that he would do that. But he also won for his larger body of work, as is normal with the Nobel Prize. But 1913 was only a couple decades into the granting of Nobel Prizes at all. So he was actually, this wasn't, I mean, this was a long time in coming, but not as long as you might think. Now, he was from India. This is a really great historical map of India from the year 1903. So it's during the time in which the British East India Company controlled Bengal, which was the home state of Rabindranath Tagore. And he was from Calcutta, which today is known as Kolkata, but the anglicized version of it is Calcutta. So that might be a more familiar city name for your students. And that was controlled by the East India Company from the late 18th century to the early 20th century. And during that time, there was also this cultural flourishing called the Bengali Renaissance, which was a literary, artistic, and scientific movement in which Tagore and a lot of other people really tried to contribute to the culture of India, kind of in opposition to the presence of British culture in India. So this was trying to take Indian culture and science and mathematics and other things, even like filmmaking, and really give it a boost and give it a lot of attention. And it was a very important time period for a lot of reasons. And so that red square is the state of Bengal as it looked in 1903. I'm going to zoom in on it, and you can see where Calcutta is, Kolkata. But it doesn't look like this today, because the partition in 1947 between largely Hindu areas and largely Muslim areas created a break down through the state of Bengal. And now the eastern part of this is the country of Bangladesh. And the western part of this is now called West Bengal. So Kolkata today is in West Bengal. So that's one of the changes. Okay, so what did Tagore do? Like I said, he was a thinker and an educator, and he was critical of a lot of things. Of course, he was one of the people who was critical of the British colonial presence in India, but he was also critical of some of the practices, the traditional practices in India itself, like the caste system. He was from the Brahmin caste, and he was from a very educated family. So he wasn't from the bottom of society, but he was still against a system that would treat people differently based on that. He was very critical of Western society. He had a lot to praise about the West, but he was also critical about the way that they were focused more on money than on spirituality. Although he was against British colonial rule, he was critical of the way that a lot of the nationalist movements in India were turning kind of violent. And he died 6 years before India became independent, so he didn't get to live to see that. But overall, he was supportive of more things than he was critical of. He was a humanist above and beyond anything else. And he, in his works and his poetry, he praises the human spirit, human spirituality, connection to nature, above more materialistic concerns and more divisive concerns. He looked for things that would connect everybody together. And in the lesson idea, it uses a few different text sources that you can find at the Library of Congress. And these are 2 letters that he wrote. And so they kind of show some of his attitudes towards British in India. So I'm just going to read really quickly just an excerpt of the first one on the left, where he's at a dinner party with some British officers. And so he says, he was a fully developed John Bull. Now, John Bull is, of course, it's the nickname for a Brit, the same way Uncle Sam is the nickname for an American. John Bull of the outrageous type, with a huge beak of a nose, cunning eyes, and a yard-long chin. The curtailment of our right to be tried by jury is now under consideration by the government. He's talking about the Indians being able to serve on juries. The fellow dragged in the subject by the ears and insisted on arguing it out with our host. He said the moral standard of the people in this country was low, that they had no real belief in the sacredness of life, so that they were unfit to serve on juries. The utter contempt with which we are regarded by these people was brought home to me to see how they can accept a Bengali's hospitality and talk thus, seated at his table without a quiver of compunction. So this really touches on maybe the presumption and the arrogance that he thinks is reflected in a lot of the British officers' disregard of the Indians, while at the same time they are accepting their hospitality. And on the other one on the right, he says, if we begin to attach too much importance to the applause of Englishmen, we shall have to get rid of much that is good in us and to accept much that is bad from them. So that statement seems to be against the idea of cultural assimilation for the British. And I'm not going to get into these longer passages because we don't have time, but they're connected to the lesson idea. And the lesson idea also goes on to include excerpts from a newspaper article talking about Tagore's visits to the United States. He came to the United States twice, and both times he was very celebrated. If you read the papers, they're like, oh, this famous Indian poet is in town. And some of the articles that I read are really insulting towards him and say racist things about him. And some of them are very complimentary. So you get, a bit of a mixed reaction to his presence, the presence of a foreign intellectual who comes. And part of this is also, I'm sure, because he scolds America as he says goodbye. So he is critical of a lot of things in America. But I'm going to read the third paragraph down just to kind of sum up his feelings in this first one. Inexperience, impoliteness, intolerance, and materialism are the faults of Americans, he says. Genius, daring, inquisitiveness, and frankness, the charms. So again, he has a lot of good things to say and admire about America, but also a lot of bad things, and he doesn't hold back when he says them. And, he also traveled to Japan and like tons of other countries. And so he mentions that as well. But he talks about Americans like, you're a young country. You're just children, okay? You got to grow out of this immature stuff and become more spiritual. And then the excerpt on the right is from another newspaper article, which is longer, but which I have, and I'll show you, I've excerpted it within the lesson plan into a handout. So here's the lesson idea. And if you click on this article, you'll see the handout and you'll see the 5 different excerpts from this longer article from 1930. This is his second visit to the United States. And so those are blown up. So you can divide kids into groups to handle these if you want, but it's more kind of like, what are the Eastern values that he admires? What are the Western values that he admires? And what does he have to say about America? So you can tie this into American history as well, but this is largely a lesson idea for world history because it is a really great case study and a way to kind of get into that standard that talks about British colonial rule in India in the world history standards for high school, because you can do it through the lens of this really famous person. And there's some really wonderful videos that talk about him. And the one that was my favorite that I picked, that I linked to, is 9 minutes long, but all of it is really good. And it's a short biography of his life. And the way it's animated makes it really engaging for young people. And also the animations are based on Tagore's own artwork. So it's really pretty in style. And then for a little bit more clarification, I have identified 1 minute from a longer video from the Crash Course with John Green series that also talks about Indian imperialism and Tagore's role in that. So those are all things that can help with this. And so now you know who Rabindranath Tagore is. And I am going to turn it back over to Kira.
Thank you, Stacey. Yeah, I had never heard of him either. And I actually took a course on like Gandhi and, when I was an undergrad, I never remember running across him. And it's interesting to see, again, someone else that you can use to teach that period in Indian history to kind of juxtapose with Gandhi, who, at least most people have heard of. So for my lesson idea this month, if you watched last month or checked out our newsletter, you know that we did the 1970s. And so I kind of got stuck in the 70s. And so let's see here. Let me make sure that I'm picking the right screen to share with you guys here. When we were talking about doing notable first, the first thing that came to mind for me, again, coming fresh off the 1970s that we did last month, was thinking about Gerald Ford and how he was the first person to serve as president who had never actually been on the ballot for either president or vice president. And so as I got into kind of researching this a little more, I actually found a couple of other cool things about the story that I wasn't aware of. One thing that I know was brought up to us here in the last month, or actually probably longer than that, was, folks looking for resources on kind of the more modern decades of American history. And so we've been thinking a lot about this, and also thinking about maybe some things that we weren't as familiar with when we were getting US history in school. And so thinking about the 70s, is definitely one of those periods that I feel like probably we didn't get as much instruction on when I was in school as probably should have. So thinking about Gerald Ford and the 25th Amendment, of course, he is the first unelected vice president to assume the presidency. And he is also the first vice president to assume the presidency under the provisions of the 25th Amendment, which I don't know that I had quite realized that came into play with him as well. So I wanted to do a little thinking about, okay, well, how, what was the impact of the 25th Amendment? Why was it ratified then? And then how do we get to the point that Ford, assumes the presidency? So just a couple quick little trivia points for you. So thinking about first, thinking about the question of how often has a vice president needed to succeed the president in US history? And of course, most of us probably are familiar with quite a few of these. We think about Johnson and, probably Truman, Lyndon Johnson. So this has happened 7 times. So, we know that, when the president, something happens that they're no longer able to serve, then the vice president steps up. But how often has the vice presidency been vacated? And the answer to this is actually quite a few times. And in fact, in one of the resource articles that I found, it says basically by the time that the 25th Amendment is ratified, the vice presidency position had been open about 20% of the time that the US had been a country, which to me was just wild. Who would have thought that it had been that often? And going through this list, of course, we think, most of this, about half of them is when, vice president needed to become president. Well, what we would assume that happened, that the new vice president would be added, is not at all what was happening. Prior to the 25th Amendment, if a vice president was made president, then the office was just left vacant until the next election. So that for, example, when Andrew Jackson, actually not him, John Tyler, for example, who was seated to the presidency, once he became president, there wasn't another vice president until the next election. The other thing that has happened quite frequently in the history of the vice presidency is that the vice president has died in office. And so when that happened, again, it was just left open. And there's been once or twice that a vice president resigned. For example, and his name just escaped me. We did have John Calhoun. He actually just resigned while he was vice president. But you have all these instances that have happened where the vice presidency has been vacated. And so then, what would happen if then the presidency would become vacated if you didn't have a vice president? Well, this is a question that really became top of mind after Lyndon Johnson was made president after the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And part of the reason for that was that Lyndon Johnson had a history of heart disease and had had multiple heart attacks prior to becoming president. And the person who I don't know right off, but who was the Speaker of the House, was also quite elderly. And so they were worried about the fact that you had, a president who had a history of heart disease. And then the next person in line was someone who, again, also advanced years and could potentially die. And so that really kind of got the ball rolling that we need to actually have a formal system for what happens when, a vice president needs to become president, what is the actual formal line of succession, and actually kind of, again, put some of these things into writing and ratify this as part of the Constitution. And so that's what happened with the 25th Amendment and getting it ratified. And so that you see by February 10th, 1967 was when that was actually officially ratified and made part of the Constitution. This is not the full text of it. This is just kind of the first half of it. So you can see that there are 4 sections to it, and we're going to look at these more closely here in a few minutes. So then we get into the 70s, and of course, we think a lot about the Nixon administration, of course, the Watergate scandal. But before Watergate, there was the scandal around Spiro Agnew, who was the vice president for Nixon prior to Gerald Ford. And Spiro Agnew actually had to resign about a little less than a year prior to Nixon's resignation. And the reason for that was that he had become embroiled in an investigation from his time when he was an official for the state of Maryland, including the governor of Maryland, for tax evasion and corruption. And at first, when that investigation got started, they weren't really targeting him. They were looking at some other people who were kind of current officials, and as they got into the investigation, things kind of led in his direction. And so Agnew really tried to resist resignation for quite a while, but when it became clear that he was going to be indicted, he was forced into resigning and actually worked out a plea deal where he would plead out and not have to serve jail time for his role in this corruption and tax evasion. So October 10th, 1973, he resigns, and now for the first time we have the 25th Amendment, which leads the way into actually having a new vice president be named when that office becomes open. And so over the course of about 2 months, it takes for them to actually put Gerald Ford into the office of vice president. So through that official new process that they had. Now, the other thing that's happening during this time, of course, is the Watergate investigation. And so that really, over the course there between 73 and 74, every week, almost every day, there are new headlines coming out about investigations and corruption that's happening between both the president and the vice president for separate instances. So it's again quite a challenging time. And in fact, we have this Herb Block political cartoon that we use, and I've linked to in the lesson idea that you can use with students to kind of get help to lay some of that foundation. And so here we see Nixon seated at the head of the table, listed as an unindicted co-conspirator. And really, he's left largely on his own at this point, because you can see with all the chairs around the table, the different people who had been part of his administration who had been found guilty for other issues. So see there, we see Agnew here, and this chair where he had been found guilty. And then we see some of the other folks. And so again, he is really, Nixon is left by himself at this point. And of course, I've included here the context label from for this item that's within the exhibit that the Library of Congress has. And so again, you can use that to help students to kind of get some larger context for what's going on. So by August 9th, of course, Nixon has to resign because of the Nixon tapes and, in his role in the Watergate scandal. And again, now we have the 25th Amendment coming into play. And so here is where you can have your students go through and actually read the 25th Amendment and begin to understand what elements of this, was being brought into play, both when Agnew resigned and when Nixon resigned. And so that you can see how Gerald Ford is coming in and how the 25th Amendment is propelling him into these offices. And so one of the things, you can talk about whenever there is a vacancy in the office of the vice president, the president shall nominate a vice president who shall take the office upon confirmation of a majority vote by both houses of Congress. And so both the House and the Senate would need to vote on who that new vice president would be. And then, of course, once Nixon resigned, we get into Section 1. In the case of the removal of the president from the office or of his death or resignation, the vice president shall become president. And so Ford actually goes through both Sections 2 and 1 as he accedes to office. And if you want to get into a little kind of background history on the 25th Amendment, and again, some of the other reasons that it was needed, you could also, of course, bring into play conversations about what had happened when James Garfield had been shot. And so he was incapacitated for a length of time, and there really wasn't a president serving while he was incapacitated. And then the same thing with Woodrow Wilson when he had his stroke, and now it is pretty much accepted that his wife was running the country during that period of time. And so again, the 25th Amendment was meant to really kind of address all of these situations that had happened in US history. So after students have had a chance to, again, kind of read through this, examine it, think about how it comes into play at this section, again, you can talk about, of course, this is where Ford accedes to office. You could talk about his prior roles in the House of Representatives and why he was such a respected figure, that he was pretty easily agreed upon by both members, both Democrats and Republicans in both houses. He was well respected. So after he takes office, he makes some remarks upon taking the oath of office. And this is a great speech that you can use with students to really kind of get at the importance and kind of the uniqueness of this moment in time. So I have kind of pulled some excerpts here that I think work really well, that kind of get at again, why this is such a unique moment where he is acknowledging that. So he talks about here at the beginning that he's assumed the presidency under extraordinary circumstances never before experienced by Americans. And again, talking to just the the dire moment within our political history, that this is an hour of history that troubles our hearts, our minds, and hurts our hearts. And so he says, I feel it is my first duty to make an unprecedented compact with my countrymen, not an inaugural address, because again, he knew he had not been elected. It's not a fireside chat, harkening back to FDR. It's not a campaign speech, just a little straight talk among friends. So I am acutely aware that you have not elected me as your president by your ballots, as I ask you to confirm me as your president with your prayers. You have not chosen me by secret ballot, neither have I gained office by any secret promises. I have not campaigned either for the presidency or the vice presidency. I have not subscribed to any partisan platform. I am indebted to no man and only to one woman, my dear wife, as I begin this difficult job. So it was important, again, having students realize that, this moment in our history where, again, we've had both the previous president and the previous vice president be removed from office for corruption, that, he's really trying to make clear that he is not, there wasn't some secret deal. He isn't, didn't promise anything, anyone anything in order to get this office. Again, trying to reassure Americans that they could trust their government again. He talks about, that he had not, had not sought the office, but he was ready to take on the responsibility of it. He says that bond, though strained, is unbroken at home and abroad. In my public and private acts as your president, I expect to follow my instincts of openness and candor with full confidence, that honesty is always the best policy in the end. So again, trying to address the issues of corruption and people having distrust in their government. And probably the most important and notable piece of this that people have heard is, my fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over. Again, talking about the investigations into the Watergate scandal. Our Constitution works. Our great republic is a government of laws and not of men. And as we bind up the internal wounds of Watergate, more painful and more poisonous than those of foreign wars, let us restore the golden rule to our political process. Let brotherly love purge our hearts of suspicion and of hate. And so again, I think this really gets at just the dire, crisis that the country was in as a result of the various corruption issues in the Nixon administration, and how Ford is trying to address that in this moment, again, as he is acceding to office, again, as someone who had never been on the ballot. And again, I think that is really important to bring out to students as you go forward. So within this lesson idea, there are links to several different things, including I said a great piece about the 25th Amendment that has a nice contextual piece that you can use with students. There's a link to this address here from Ford. And of course, you could use this to align with standards both for the high school U.S. history course as well as for government and civics. Like I said, this is a great example to talk about, the 25th Amendment and how it works and why it's important. So that is, our lesson idea on Gerald Ford and the 25th Amendment. So the other lesson idea that I want to share with you all is related to the lesson idea that our graduate student, who is not with us today because she is on spring break, that she did for us, and that is on the Transcontinental Railroad. And so this lesson idea really gets into, again, why this is important, and again, some great resources that you can use for getting into teaching about the importance of this within our nation's history, and of course, the important milestone that this was within transportation and infrastructure in the country. Within the lesson idea itself, that you can find on page 3 in the newsletter, she links to a couple great blog entries. And so you can see this one here for the Lewis and Clark expedition. Actually, this is an American's Library story. So again, this works great for elementary age students. But this article and link here with the Homestead Act and this one here on the world's first transcontinental railroad go to really good blog articles. So for example, what those look like. Let's see. Make sure that you're seeing the right, thank you. So you should be seeing the research guide for this. Is that, hopefully that's what everyone is seeing. Okay, perfect. So with this, you'll see that there is a great little contextual piece that talks about, again, the history of the Transcontinental Rail line. So that's a nice piece, and it's got some links to some different books, some digital resources that you can use with this, as well as some internet resources. So again, this is one of those great things about the research guides. There is then within what she has within the lesson idea itself, of course, your students will need to have a little bit of contextual information. So she has linked to a blog on the gold rush, and I wanted to show you this because the resources that were within this one I thought were particularly great. Pull that up real quick because I didn't have that one opened. So again, this is one of the blogs, and this is from the picture this. So this is from the blogs associated with the Prints and Photographs division. And so you can see within this, she's it's talking about the gold rush, but you'll see these great images that are actually connected and featured that talk about the gold rush. And so again, this is why we love these blog entries so much, because they do actually highlight some wonderful sources. And so again, you could use these sources to talk about the gold rush. And then within the lesson idea itself, she has students looking at different railroad advertisements. And so there is this one that is featured in one of the Lewis and Clark exhibits that the Library of Congress has. And you can see that as part of a larger book. And then let's see. There is this page that is linked. So that you can see, this is from the Central Pacific Railroad Photographic History Museum, and there are quite a few really great images here, advertisements for the railroad that students you could divide them up and have students look at these individually. It was a really good map, again, that shows that. So you have that one that you can use. There is, of course, this famous image that you could use in the group as one of the final ones, again, showing the joining of the tracks and the golden spike. And then also there is this article from Chronicling America. So again, you can look at this particular passage right here, which is linked into is the one that's linked in the newsletter lesson idea. So having your students divide up, and you can use the Hippo analysis sheet to get at begin thinking about why this is important and doing some historical thinking around that. The other source here that I think is really interesting that you could use with your students to talk about the Transcontinental Railroad is this map right here, which is the image that is featured in the lesson idea. And of course, if you view this on the Library of Congress site, you can see that you can zoom in to be able to get great detail on this map. So this lesson idea can be adapted to meet standards for the high school U.S. history standard, as well as I'm sure you could also bring this into some of the younger standards for fifth grade as well. So with that, hopefully it gives you guys some ideas for how to use some of the railroad maps as well. And I'm going to turn things over to Stacy now.
Okay, I'm back. And so you've already seen all three of our lesson ideas, and now we're going to look at some of the other resources that we have in this issue of our newsletter. So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen, and starting from the beginning, Kira picked the awesome source of the month, but I love it too because we just learned about this from reading the book that we read with the TPS Virtual Book Club recently, that the very first US president to travel outside the United States during his presidential administration was Theodore Roosevelt. Boy, he was a first in many ways. And so Kira found this awesome source too, so that we could fit that in somehow. Now with a lot of firsts, they have to do with, oh, the first telephone, oh, the first, unmanned or manned air flight, manned sustained air flight, and all these kinds of things that are very easy to point to, the first transatlantic telegram message. And so we thought that instead of just doing a single lesson idea on one of them, we would just pull together a lot of the resources that are about that technological firsts that we have both on our website and on the Library of Congress. And so I'm just going to take you through a few of these. Now, it does include a couple lesson plans from Dr. Perry Loudon, who back when he was a middle school teacher at Rockville several years ago, created a lot of great lesson plans for TPS-MTSU. And he taught at that time the career technical classes. And so he would deal a lot with technology, but he was really interested in working in those historical primary sources too. So for instance, he has a lesson plan about the telegraph during the Civil War, which is not a first, but it's also an interesting lesson plan. But the ones that I included from him in here are the invention of the telephone, Alexander Graham Bell, of course. And he has one on the Wright brothers flying evolution. And the Library of Congress has a lot of Wright brothers stuff as well, because it holds the collection of the Wright brothers family papers. And so there's also a link to a primary source set at the teacher's page for the Wright brothers. So if you're teaching that technological first, not only do you have diaries and documents, but you have these absolutely fantastic photographs. Some of these are incredibly famous. This was taken by, he has such a great name. It was Canute. So, okay, where was I? Back, oh, nope, don't want that anymore. Okay. And then of course, things about the telegraph. There is the Morse collection at the Library of Congress. And so this isn't a lesson plan or a primary source set, but it is, if you go to the collection homepage, you'll find that under articles and essays, they have a nice brief informational essay about the invention of the telegraph in context. And so this is a really great resource to provide to your students to give them some background that's probably better than what's in a textbook. And the same thing under the telephone and multiple telegraph, which is a phrase, a technical term that I hadn't heard before, but that's what Graham Bell was actually going for, because he worked a lot with the speech impaired. So he was going for ways of communication that people with disabilities could take advantage of. And so it's really interesting to read about his process here. You see, it's not even that long. So it's something your students could even read in class, or it's just a resource for you to have so that you could better explain some of these to your students. There is a whole collection on the gramophone. Emil Berliner was the inventor of the gramophone, so a bunch of early sound recording devices. And this is great for doing a change through time kind of lesson for students, because they might be familiar with the way that they access musical recordings today. And I'm sure that they know about vinyl, and they've heard their parents talk about cassette tapes maybe. And so you can be like, well, look, this is what they used to have to play, but it wasn't even before vinyl, they had wax cylinders. And so, blow their minds with that. And then you can say, this is old even for me. But that's just a really great story, and it's a way to connect them to what they're already familiar with today. And then of course there's Thomas Edison. Guglielmo Marconi did the first transatlantic radio transmission, and this is a Topics in Chronicling America guide, which is one of those where they've already picked out a bunch of articles that talk about this, and so you can just go and pick out which one you might want to use, and those are always fun for people's reactions at the time, which might seem quaint to us today. Oh boy, oops, I backed out of the document. Okay, and then I threw in there at the end, there's an everyday mysteries section within the Library of Congress that we haven't visited for quite a while. It's still there, but you know, first telephone, first toothbrush, first electric Christmas lights, first frozen food. They have these little question and answer write-ups, and it looks like this. So who invented frozen food? What was the first frozen food? Clarence Birdseye. That name might be familiar if you've ever bought frozen vegetables. So, and this just kind of a fun little, very easy to read and share with students, maybe as a bell ringer in class, and it always includes some fun images too. So those are the ones that we have picked for technological firsts. We also have extra stuff, as we always do, in our important links box, which is some additional technological firsts. The first copyrighted motion picture, which is from this really great resource. And so you have to scroll to page 23 to get to that article. This is the Library of Congress's magazine. And so it's obviously got a lot of really great graphics and kind of short, popular articles. But here we have the blacksmith's shop. Yep, over 100 years old. So there's your answer to that. Also, the Waldseemüller map, of course, is the first map that has the word America on the continent of America ever, and that's from 1507. Now, of course, it's on the continent of South America because South America is more well drawn than the continent of North America. And we do a lot of stuff with the Waldseemüller map. That's just the name of the map maker. And he's following the findings of Amerigo Vespucci over the old Ptolemaic worldview map. Charles Lindbergh, we have an old lesson idea from a newsletter a few years ago on the history of the smallpox vaccine, which is very interesting. The Magna Carta, of course, another first in so many ways. We have another old lesson idea from a newsletter on the Magna Carta. Marie Curie, the Indianapolis 500-mile race. What was the first one of those? You can read all the newspaper articles about that. And of course, Jackie Robinson, the first African-American to play in the 20th century Major League Baseball leagues. And on page 4, we have some fun things. The first selfie. I actually have had a printout because the first time I saw this picture on the Library of Congress, I fell in love with it. It was just such an interesting looking kind of capture of somebody's expression. And so I had printed it out and cut it out and put it on my desk. And it had lived there for years until we moved. And now I don't know where it is. But I was scrolling through Facebook today, and I'm going to show you what came up. And I'm like, the algorithms on Facebook are really eerie. How did it know that I was going to be talking about this selfie today? But in the account for old photos, somebody did a retouch of what that selfie is supposed to look like with more modern camera technology. So, and I'm like, really? Oh, yeah, I guess so. That's really well done. So if that would speak more to your students, you can show them that. But this is from 1839. So this is talking about really early camera technology. And so there's a really great story about early daguerreotypes. First full-length animated feature film, Snow White, from Disney. And so there's some great stories and links about that. Who was the first European to come to North America in a way that actually ended in settlement? This blurb asks, maybe Leif Erikson and not Columbus. And Norway certainly thought so. They actually commissioned, and Kira found this, they commissioned a replica of this Viking ship in 1893 to be built so that they could test whether or not it could actually make that transatlantic voyage. And Kira didn't?
It did. And what is interesting is, it's even more interesting, and I actually think it's kind of funny, is that this was all done as part of a way to showcase this during the Columbia Exposition as a way to basically troll and be like, you guys can celebrate Columbus, but he wasn't first, which I just find hilarious. But yes, it did successfully make it.
Stealing his thunder. But yeah, this would have beat Columbus by a whole 500 years, if I'm doing my math right. And there's actually a historic site where this settlement was up in Newfoundland that you can go visit today. And then what was the first national park created in the United States? It was Yellowstone. So you could have guessed it was one of those ones out west that starts with a Y. Yellowstone is the correct answer. And I noticed that there are these really beautiful paintings of different scenes from Yellowstone. And I thought, oh, great, I have a great image to use with my blurb. And then I started reading about the artist. I'm like, oh, he was really interesting. He actually went on a trip with the US Geographical Survey. And dude, that famous photographer whose name is somehow escaping me. Sorry about that. And they went to kind of go scout out this area, and he drew these sketches and he sent them back, and his sketches were actually very helpful in encouraging lawmakers back east that, oh, this is such a beautiful, fantastic natural area. We should do something to preserve it. So his artwork was, it brought him prominence. So it was a, first time that he gets national prominence. But this also leads to the first time the United States creates a national park. So all these links kind of go to that. Now there's for the younger students, there's an article in America's Story about him where you can see some of his sketches that he did sketches, and then when he got back east, he turned them into more polished paintings. And the paintings that came out in 1872, based on his 1871 sketches, there's a link to where you can find those too in the Library of Congress. And there's some at the Smithsonian as well. So if you Google him, Thomas Moran, Yellowstone, you'll find tons of really great things, way before Ansel Adams took pictures of it. So yeah, that's the last of our firsts for today. So I'm going to turn it back to Kira.
All right, so as we get ready to wrap up, just again, a reminder that you can find the resources for today's session on the Padlet. So again, we invite you to be sure to check that out. Also, if you have not already done so, we encourage you to complete the survey that Discover Tennessee History, our collaborative with several of the different organizations working with teachers across the state, have put together not quite short, but a survey for educators trying to identify ways that our organizations can better serve you guys, both in the PD that we offer, as well as the resources that we create. So please take a few minutes, scan this QR code, fill out that survey. Shouldn't take you more than 5-10 minutes max, depending on how elaborative you want to be in your answers. But we really would appreciate your feedback on that survey. And if you are interested in receiving PD credit for today's session, be sure to complete the survey here. We send out the PD certificates for these sessions for those of you viewing the recording. about once a week. For those of you who are attending live, you will receive your certificate within 24 hours, roughly. Definitely be sure to fill that out if you are interested in receiving PD credit. Next month, we will be back on April the 13th. Our topic for next month is countercultures. So that should be an interesting conversation, thinking about different, moments in time that countercultures have been relevant. We also have 2 different in-person workshops coming up this spring, including on April the 29th. We will be in Crossville, working with the East Tennessee Historical Society on a project funded by Tennessee Humanities that will be exploring the New Deal, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and the home front. And we will get a chance to actually visit the Cumberland Homesteads Tower Museum. So if you get a chance and are interested in that, please join us. That is on a Saturday. And you can find information about how to register with that in this month's newsletter. And then on May the 10th, we will be in Chattanooga at the Medal of Honor Heritage Center, focusing on thinking about how we can teach World War II and thinking about how connecting that with Tennessee and Tennessee stories. So definitely think about joining us for that on May the 10th. We would hope to see you guys there. And the last PDB opportunity that we have coming up for the spring semester is the final in the Discover Tennessee History webinar series, which is on next Tuesday. March the, what is that, the 9th?
Today is the 9th.
Oh, no, the 14th, sorry.
14th,
yes. So March the 14th, and that will be our session. And we're going to be pulling out some of our favorite resources for teaching Tennessee history. So if you're interested in doing that, let me know and I can get you added to the registration list for that session. So thank you guys so much. We hope to see you next month and see you guys then.